All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling adult ADHD.
Yeah, it's a topic that deserves a lot more attention than it usually gets.
Absolutely. And to guide our deep dive, we've got this really in-depth review article from, let me see, the primary care companion to the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. It's called simply Adult ADHD.
Straightforward title, right?
Yeah, but the content is anything but simple. This article, it really digs deep into just how much ADHD can impact adults.
It's not just kids, right? It goes way beyond that.
Right. This deep dive, it's going to show us how ADHD can really touch every corner of an adult's life.
Work, relationships, you name it.
Exactly, even broader societal stuff. But okay, first things first, can we just debunk this myth that ADHD is something you just grow out of?
Oh man, if only. This article, it makes it super clear. ADHD, it doesn't just magically disappear.
So how many adults are we talking about who are actually living with this?
Well, it's a lot more common than you might think. This review, it says something like 2.5% to 5% of adults are dealing with ADHD.
Really? That many?
And get this, there's research that suggests that maybe even 40% of men in prison might have ADHD.
40%. That's a huge number.
It really makes you think, right? What happens when a condition that's that common goes undiagnosed, untreated?
You're right, especially in a place like prison. But hold on, I always thought ADHD was all about hyperactivity.
You and pretty much everyone else.
So how does it actually show up in adults then?
Well, some adults, yeah, they still experience hyperactivity,
Okay.
but it's often different from, the classic kid running around image.
So less outwardly hyper.
Yeah, it's often more like inattention or restlessness even.
Huh.
And that so easily it can be mistaken for anxiety.
Oh, wow. So then you could have someone who's being treated for the wrong thing completely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can have serious consequences. But it's good to know, even the DSM, that's the big book of mental disorders, they've updated how they define ADHD for adults to reflect this.
The DSM-5, right?
Yeah, that's the one. They're recognizing that we need to be looking at this differently in adults.
So let's get into that then. What happens when ADHD is left untreated in adults? What are we talking about here?
Well, the research is pretty clear. At work, for example, adults with ADHD often struggle to focus on tasks.
Okay. Makes sense.
Time management is another big one.
Right.
And that can lead to, more job changes, basically. It's tough to hold down a job when you're constantly struggling with those things.
I bet. It must be incredibly frustrating feeling like you're always falling short.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And then, all those workplace challenges, they can spill over into personal relationships, too. Imagine trying to maintain a romantic relationship, but you're constantly struggling to communicate.
Yeah. Or with regulating your emotions.
Right. Both huge problems with ADHD.
Like this domino effect. But this review article, it even goes into some of the tougher stuff. Like there's a link between ADHD and antisocial behavior.
Right. That's a complex one.
So what's the connection there?
Well, sometimes ADHD, it shows up alongside other disorders, like oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. And when you throw substance abuse into the mix...
That can't be good.
No, it's not. The risk of criminal behavior goes way up.
So we're talking a whole tangle of issues. Is there any hope for people dealing with all of this?
There is, absolutely. Yeah. And this is where treatment becomes so crucial. There's a large-scale study that found that treating ADHD can actually lead to a significant drop in criminal activity. Seriously. It's not just about, managing symptoms. It's about potentially changing the course of someone's life.
Wow. That's powerful. But we can't forget about another big one, driving.
Oh, yeah.
Does ADHD impact how safe someone is behind the wheel?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
Adults with ADHD do have a higher risk of driving incidents.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
It's probably because of the attention problems, impulsivity, that kind of thing.
Sure, makes sense. But is there anything that can be done to make it safer?
Absolutely. Medication can help. Yeah. But there are also non-medication approaches that are really effective.
Like what?
Well, for example, specific training programs that focus on hazard perception. Those have been shown to really improve driving safety for people with ADHD.
So there are options. That's good to know. We've been talking about ADHD as this thing on its own, but you mentioned earlier that it rarely exists in isolation. What does that mean exactly?
So comorbidities, that's the term. Basically, it means ADHD often shows up alongside other conditions.
Oh, okay.
Especially other mental health stuff like anxiety, depression, even personality disorders.
And what's the link there?
That's the tricky part. It's like a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't know if the ADHD is causing these other problems or if it's the other way around.
So it's a real puzzle to sort out.
It can be. But here's the good news from this review. If you treat the ADHD effectively, it can often improve those other conditions too.
So it's like treating the root of the problem.
Exactly. And you can start to see these positive ripple effects. But we also have to talk about the economic impact of all of this. Untreated ADHD in adults, what's that costing us as a society? Oh, it's a lot. More healthcare visits, lower productivity at work, and then remember those comorbidities we were talking about. Untreated, those add to the costs too.
So it's a real financial burden.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the good news is that if we diagnose and manage ADHD effectively, and any comorbidities that come with it, we can actually save money in the long run. And even more importantly, we can improve people's quality of life.
That's really the ultimate goal, right?
It absolutely is.
Okay, so we've established that ADHD, it's complex, it impacts adults in all these ways, but let's talk about actually diagnosing it. This review article goes into this, and it seems like a lot of adults are slipping through the cracks.
You're absolutely right.
So why is it so hard to get diagnosed with ADHD as an adult?
Well, for one, there's that persistent myth we talked about earlier, the one about ADHD being a childhood thing.
People still believe that, even doctors.
It's more common than you might think. And that misconception, it leads to misdiagnoses all the time.
It's like we're back at square one. But are there other reasons why it's so tough to get diagnosed?
Yeah, there's still a lot of uncertainty about, like, the specific criteria for diagnosing adults. And sometimes ADHD gets seen as, I don't know, less important, I guess, compared to other mental health conditions.
So it's getting overshadowed.
Exactly. So you might have someone who's being treated for their anxiety or depression, but the underlying ADHD, the thing that might be causing those problems in the first place, it gets completely missed.
That's really concerning. How many people are out there just suffering needlessly?
More than we'd like to think, I'm sure.
Yeah.
This review actually cites a couple of studies where a pretty big percentage of adults going to psychiatric clinics, they actually had undiagnosed ADHD.
Wow, those are people who are actively trying to get help.
Right. And yet this crucial piece of the puzzle is missing.
So how do we fix this? What needs to change?
Well, for starters, we need to raise awareness, especially among general psychiatrists. They're often the first stop for people struggling with mental health. So they need to be able to recognize ADHD, even when it's mixed up with other conditions.
They need the right tools, right, to diagnose it accurately.
Exactly. And there are actually specialized tools designed just for that. They take into account all those unique ways ADHD can show up in adults.
Makes sense. So what are some examples of these tools?
Let's see, the review mentions the Brown Attention Deficit Disorder Scale. There's also the Adult ADHD Clinical Diagnostic Scale, the Connors Adult ADHD Diagnostic Interview for DSM-IV, and, the Diagnostic Interview for ADHD in Adults.
Wow, that's a lot of tools. But it sounds like they're crucial for getting people the right diagnosis.
They are. Because early and accurate diagnosis, it can really change someone's life for the better.
It gives them the power to understand what's going on, right, and get the right support.
Exactly. Now, we often hear that ADHD is more common in boys, right? But this review, it suggests things might be more complicated than that.
Especially in adults, I bet.
Yeah, the research on gender differences in adults, it's still, we're still figuring it all out.
So what's the latest thinking? What does this review say?
Well, it points to some really interesting findings. Like one study, this was done in Hungary, they found that in younger age groups, ADHD was more common in men. But when you looked at people over 40, the rates were pretty similar for both men and women.
Huh. So age plays a role.
Seems like it. And there's another interesting layer to this. Some studies actually found more women being diagnosed with ADHD in adult psychiatric settings compared to men.
Wait, really? That seems counter to everything we usually hear.
Right. So what's going on there? This review, it offers a few explanations. One is that maybe women are just more likely to seek help for things like anxiety and depression.
Which, as we talked about, often come along with ADHD.
Exactly. So they're more likely to be in settings where a mental health professional might pick up on the ADHD.
So it's not that they're more likely to have it, it's just that they're more likely to be diagnosed.
That's one possibility. And then there's this idea of referral bias during childhood.
What does that mean?
Well, traditionally, boys have been more likely to be sent for ADHD evaluations when they're kids. Maybe because they're more likely to have those really obvious externalizing behaviors.
You mean like running around and being disruptive?
Exactly. That classic ADHD kid image. But girls, they tend to have more internalizing symptoms. Things like inattention, anxiety, even depression.
And those are harder to spot.
Right. They're not as disruptive. but they can be just as debilitating for the girl experiencing them. So their ADHD might go unnoticed for years, and then it finally gets picked up when they're adults.
So a delayed diagnosis.
Exactly. And that could be why we see those higher rates of diagnosis in women later in life. It's like they've been carrying this hidden burden for years.
That's a really important point. We need to be more aware of how ADHD can look different in boys and girls, especially when they're young.
I agree. Everyone deserves to get the help they need no matter how their ADHD shows up.
All right, let's get back to driving for a minute. We were talking about the risks associated with ADHD. What does this review tell us about that?
Well, it cites a lot of research showing that adults with ADHD, they're at a higher risk for all sorts of driving incidents, collisions, speeding tickets, and just generally riskier driving behavior.
It's a serious issue.
It is, but the good news is there are ways to make it safer.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, medication, it can help,
Sure.
but there are also non-medication things that can make a difference. Like remember that hazard perception training we talked about?
Yeah.
That could be really effective for people with ADHD. It helps them anticipate dangers on the road and react quicker.
So they can be safer drivers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's all about giving people the tools they need to manage their ADHD and stay safe.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we move on, I want to touch on the economic side of things again. We talked about the individual costs, but what about the broader impact? What's the economic burden of ADHD on society as a whole?
It's huge. Lost productivity, higher healthcare costs, even the strain on the criminal justice system. It all adds up.
So it's not just an individual problem.
Not at all. It affects everyone. But the good news is that a lot of those costs, they could be avoided with early diagnosis and effective treatment.
We keep coming back to that, don't we? Early intervention is key.
It really is. It's an investment in people's well-being and in the health of our society as a whole.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Knowing what we now know about how common and impactful ADHD is in adults, what can we do? As individuals and as a society, to raise awareness, break down the stigma, and support those who might be struggling.
It's a great question. It's a complex issue, but it's one we need to be talking about.
Every voice matters, right?
Absolutely. By sharing our knowledge, challenging misconceptions, and speaking up for those who need support, we can make a real difference.
Well said. And that's a great place to pause for now. Stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the different ways ADHD can be managed and what the future might hold for adults living with this condition.
Early intervention and a holistic approach, those are key for managing adult ADHD.
Absolutely. But what does that actually look like? What are our options here? This deep dive, it wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about treatment.
Right. Got to cover that.
So what does the research say? What are the most effective ways to manage adult ADHD?
Well, this review article, it makes it clear a combination of approaches tends to work best.
Okay, so no magic bullet.
No, unfortunately not.
So what are we talking about then?
It's often a mix of medication, therapy, and some lifestyle changes.
Okay, let's break that down. Let's start with medication. What are the most common meds for adult ADHD?
Stimulants are usually the first line of treatment. Things like methylphenidate, you might know it as Ritalin.
Okay.
And then there's amphetamine, that's Adderall.
I've heard of those. And how do they work? What do they actually do?
So they basically boost certain brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine and norepinephrine.
And those are important for
Attention, focus, impulse control, all those things that can be tough with ADHD.
Right. So the meds help get those chemicals back in balance.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, they can be really helpful. Improve focus, reduce impulsivity, even help with emotional regulation.
But I'm guessing there are downsides too.
Yeah, there's going to be side effects. Insomnia, some people lose their appetite. Anxiety can be a problem.
Not ideal.
Definitely not. That's why it's so important to work closely with a doctor, find the right med and the right dose to minimize those side effects.
Makes sense. But what about people who can't take stimulants or maybe just don't want to? Are there other options?
Absolutely. That's where therapy comes in. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that's a really good one for ADHD.
And what does CBT focus on?
It's all about identifying and changing those negative thought patterns and behaviors that are, making things harder.
So it's about giving people tools to manage their ADHD on their own.
Exactly. Learning coping mechanisms for procrastination, for getting organized, even for regulating your emotions.
That sounds really helpful. What about lifestyle stuff? Can that play a role too?
Big time. Exercise, diet, sleep, all those basic things, they can make a surprising difference.
I mean, those are good for everyone, right? But you're saying they're especially important for people with ADHD.
Yeah. Exercise, for example, it can actually increase dopamine levels naturally.
Oh, so it's kind of like a natural stimulant.
In a way, yeah. And that can really help with focus and attention. And then a healthy diet, it can keep your blood sugar stable so you don't have those energy crashes that can make ADHD symptoms worse.
So it sounds like we're talking about a multi-pronged approach here. Medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, all working together.
You got it. And the important thing to remember, managing ADHD effectively, it's an ongoing process. It's not like you take a pill and you're cured.
It's a commitment, right?
Absolutely. It takes self-awareness and a willingness to, experiment a little, try different things until you find what works for you.
Okay, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier. That statistic about the high rates of ADHD in prison, it really got me thinking.
It's a powerful statistic.
Why do you think there's this connection?
It's complex, but this article, it offers some insights.
Yeah.
For one thing, people with ADHD, they often struggle in structured environments.
Like school, work, even prison, right?
Exactly. And if you have trouble with impulsivity, hyperactivity, not following the rules,
That could definitely lead to problems with the law.
it could. And then you have to consider the societal factors. People from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're already more likely to end up in the criminal justice system.
And I'm guessing they also have less access to ADHD diagnosis and treatment.
It's a vicious cycle. The very things that make someone vulnerable also make it harder to get the help they need.
So it's a systemic issue, not just a personal one.
Absolutely. We need to look at the bigger picture if we're going to make a real difference.
And speaking of the bigger picture, we've talked a lot about the economic burden of ADHD, the costs to individuals, families, society. But what can we actually do about it?
The answer keeps coming back to early intervention and effective management.
Right. If we address ADHD early, we can potentially prevent a lot of those downstream costs.
Exactly. Think about it. Less lost productivity, fewer healthcare visits, even a lower burden on the criminal justice system. It's an investment that pays off on multiple levels.
And it's not just about the money, right? It's about improving people's lives.
Absolutely. Giving people with ADHD the support they need to reach their full potential, that's what it's all about.
And to do that, we need to break down the stigma, right?
Yeah.
Make it okay for people to talk about ADHD and seek help.
100%. Too many people are suffering in silence.
So how do we change that? How do we get the message out there?
Education is a big part of it. Educating the public, educating healthcare professionals. We need to make sure everyone understands what ADHD is, how it presents in adults, and how important early intervention is.
It's about changing the narrative, right?
Yeah.
ADHD isn't a character flaw. It's a treatable condition.
Exactly. And we need to create environments where people feel safe asking for help.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of challenges, but I want to end this part of our deep dive on a positive note. What gives you hope? What are some positive trends you're seeing in the field of adult ADHD?
Well, for one, we're having this conversation.
That's a good sign, right?
It is. Awareness is growing, research is moving forward, and we have more effective treatment options than ever before.
So things are changing for the better.
They are. And we're starting to see a real shift in how we view ADHD. It's not about labeling people. It's about understanding their unique challenges and giving them the tools they need to thrive.
We're moving away from that deficit-based model, right? The one that just focuses on what's wrong.
Exactly. We're recognizing that people with ADHD often have amazing strengths. They're creative, they think outside the box, they bring a unique perspective to the world.
It's about celebrating those strengths.
Absolutely. And as we continue to challenge those old misconceptions, I think we're going to see a much more inclusive and supportive world for people with ADHD.
I love that vision. Okay, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to ask our listeners something. Thinking about everything we've talked about today, the impact of ADHD, the need for awareness and support, what role do you think each of us can play in creating a better future for adults with ADHD?
That's a great question to ponder. We all have a part to play in this.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? But even with all this talk about ADHD, there are still so many people who just don't get it.
Oh yeah, the misconceptions are out there, big time.
So what's the biggest hurdle? What are we up against here?
I think it's that people tend to have this really narrow view of what ADHD is.
The hyperactive kid, right, bouncing off the walls.
Yeah, or the adult who's always losing their keys and can't meet a deadline.
Yeah.
But it's so much more complicated than that.
So we need to broaden our understanding of how ADHD can actually show up in adults.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this review article, it does a great job of showing that. ADHD It can manifest in so many ways.
It's not just about being hyperactive and impulsive.
Nope. It can involve emotional regulation problems,
Okay.
difficulty with executive function.
Executive function. What's that?
So those are the higher level thinking skills we use to plan, organize, manage time, make decisions.
Oh, right.
And those can be really impaired in adults with ADHD. So it's not just about being lazy or unmotivated.
There's an actual neurological reason for those struggles.
Exactly. And then there's sensory processing. Some people with ADHD are super sensitive to certain stimuli.
Like loud noises or bright lights.
Exactly. While others might be the opposite, like they need really intense sensory experiences to feel anything.
Wow, I never thought about that.
It just goes to show ADHD, it can affect people's lives in ways we might not even realize.
It's way more than just those stereotypical symptoms we always hear about.
Right. And that's a really important takeaway from all of this. ADHD is complex. It looks different in everyone. There's no single ADHD personality.
So no more stereotypes. Each person's experience is unique.
Exactly. And that means their treatment and support should be unique too. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And this review, it talks a lot about a holistic approach, right? It's not just about popping a pill.
Exactly. Medication, it can be really helpful.
Sure.
But it's not the whole story. We have to think about therapy, lifestyle changes, even accommodations at work or school.
Creating an environment where people with ADHD can actually thrive.
That's the goal.
Mhm.
And it takes a team effort.
I know.
Doctors, therapists, educators, employers, and of course the individual themselves.
All working together.
Right. It's about empowering people with ADHD to understand their own needs and advocate for themselves.
That's such a powerful message. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into adult ADHD, I want to end on a positive note. We've talked about all the challenges, the misconceptions, but what gives you hope? What are some good things happening in this field?
Well, the fact that we're even having this conversation is a good thing. Awareness is growing.
Okay, that's a start.
Research is moving forward. We're understanding the brain better. And we have more effective treatments available than ever before. So yeah, there's reason to be optimistic.
That's good to hear. What else are you seeing?
I think we're starting to see a real shift in how we view ADHD. It's less about, what's wrong with someone and more about understanding their strengths and helping them succeed.
Celebrating their unique way of being in the world?
Exactly. People with ADHD, they often have incredible talents, creativity, they think outside the box. It's about finding ways to let those strengths shine.
So well said. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of adult ADHD. It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
And I hope our listeners have walked away with a better understanding of this often misunderstood condition. ADHD, it's complex, it presents in so many ways, but with the right support, people can absolutely thrive.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about knowledge, awareness, and creating a more supportive and inclusive world for everyone.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, information is power. The more we learn about ADHD, the more we can help ourselves and those around us. So keep learning, keep sharing, and keep advocating for a better future for everyone touched by ADHD.